All right, hello, I'm just admitting people as they come in, so just stand by. All right, I see we have 19. A fair amount. I'm sure more people will join. Oh, there goes another. Before we begin, does anybody have any questions for me? Did anybody have any trouble submitting their policy brief? Any issues in that regard? We all got it? Okay, very good. I saw a few of you tried to email me the policy brief, but I believe I responded to all those emails, just letting you know to submit it on SitLearn. And it looks like, let me just take a quick peek. Let's see, needs grading. It looks like the majority of you have already submitted it, so looks like everybody figured it out. All right, so today what we're going to do is start talking about mentally ill offenders. So I'll just share my screen with you. We'll look at the lecture and we'll go from there. Any questions before we begin? We're all good? Okay. All righty, so like I said, this week we're going to be talking about mentally ill offenders. So I recommend having the lecture pulled up on your laptop so that you can take notes, or if you have it printed out, you can take notes from there. One quick note, all of our quizzes from now on are going to be on SitLearn. You need Respondus lockdown browser to do the quizzes. I'm going to send an email tomorrow with 2 links. One of the links is for you to download the browser, and the other link is a quick tutorial about how to use the browser. So make sure you watch that tutorial instead of just sending me an email telling me you're confused about how to use the browser. It's a quick tutorial. It's fairly simple. All you do is download the browser, then you open the browser, and it automatically takes you to your SitLearn login. You log in and you click on quizzes, then you click the appropriate quiz, and then you take the quiz. It's fairly straightforward so far. My intro classes had no problems with it. My freshman seminars had no problems with it. Out of those 2 sections, only 1 student couldn't figure it out. And I was able to get him to have a conference call with someone with IT, and he was able to figure it out. So if you have already downloaded that browser and you've been using it for other classes, then disregard the email. Just use the one that you've already downloaded. So I'll be sending that email tomorrow, so look for that. I will remind you guys about it on Wednesday and also on Friday. So if by Wednesday and Friday, or Wednesday specifically, if you haven't received that email, please let me know and I'll send it to you personally with the links. Any questions about that? Okay, just really briefly, if you're not familiar with the software, all it does is lock your browser. So you can't be like Googling shit and like checking your email and like looking up the PowerPoints and stuff like that. Basically, it's like trying to prevent you from cheating on your 5-point quiz. Okay? Questions? No questions. Okay. Let's start talking about crazy people. Goodbye. My husband's leaving. Okay. So this week we're talking about mentally ill offenders. So the first thing we're going to talk about is just sort of how they behave in a correctional setting, as well as the overrepresentation of them in a correctional setting. Those of you that have been on the jail tour with me before have probably heard the correctional officers complain about having to deal with mentally ill offenders. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So data on incarceration and arrest rates have consistently shown that individuals with psychiatric disabilities are overrepresented in the criminal justice system compared to the general population. It's estimated that the jail population has 2 to 3 times as many individuals with a serious mental illness than the general population. So just a quick note, for people in the correctional field, an SMI means a serious mental illness. I know for you folks at the Citadel, that means something completely different. I believe Saturday morning inspection, which you guys probably aren't doing anymore. So if you hear me refer to an SMI, or you see it on the lecture, or you see it in any of the readings that we have, I am not talking about a Saturday morning inspection. I am talking about a serious mental illness, okay? So jail populations have about 2 to 3 times as many individuals with an SMI compared to the general population. And this rate has been gradually increasing. This rate has been gradually increasing since the 1980s. So the reason why we have so many people in our criminal justice system with mental illnesses, I'm going to talk about that exclusively on the next slide. So should you be bursting with questions about that, just hold your questions. I'm going to answer those with the next slide. So when we look at the prevalence rates of people with mental illnesses in our correctional system, estimates on them indicate that jail inmates have the highest rate of symptoms of mental health disorders. So when we're just looking at the symptoms, we see about 60% of jail inmates have these symptoms. State prisoners, about 49% of them have symptoms of mental illnesses. And within a federal facility, we see about 40%. So most of them are in jails, followed by state, followed by federal prisons. The other thing that we note is that a lot of the people that have symptoms of mental illnesses don't actually have a history of a mental health disorder. So if the way that we're qualifying somebody as having a history of a mental health disorder includes being told by a mental health professional that they have a mental health disorder, having an overnight stay in the hospital for psychiatric reasons, not like, an ER stay, or having used a prescription for a mental health disorder prescribed by a doctor, or have had professional mental health therapy. So that's what we're qualifying as having a history of mental health disorders. So when we look at the prevalence of people that have a history of mental health disorders, those numbers drop considerably. So only about 24% of state prisoners have a history of mental health disorders. 20% of jail inmates have a history of mental health disorders, and about 13% of federal prisoners. So we see a lot more symptoms that don't have an actual history. So when depending on our definition of prevalence of mental illness, we see differences between those numbers. Lots of them have symptoms, not nearly as many have an actual history. Now, when we're breaking it down by gender, females are much more likely to have mental health problems than males. So when we're talking about incarcerated individuals, female incarcerated individuals are much more likely to have mental health problems compared to males. So we're going to learn a new word right now. So the majority of people that have mental illnesses in the criminal justice system are dually diagnosed. So dual diagnosis means they have a mental health disorder and they have a substance abuse disorder. So there are 3 words that mean that thing. So there's dual diagnosis, a co-occurring disorder, and comorbidity. Those three things all mean the same thing. It means that somebody has a mental illness and a substance abuse problem. Dual diagnosis, co-occurring disorder, or comorbidity. If you see those three terms, they all mean the same thing. So let's talk about how these people with mental illnesses do their time in prison. Not well is long and short of it. So the first thing to note is that when we look at the amount of time they spend in a correctional facility, when you're comparing somebody with a mental illness compared to somebody that does not, people with mental illnesses are often given longer sentences and wind up spending more time in an incarcerated setting compared to somebody that does not have a mental illness when they've been convicted of the same crime. So not only do they spend longer times in an incarcerated setting, they don't do their time very well. When we're looking at state prisoners, people with mental illnesses are twice as likely to have been injured in a fight since admission, and jail inmates are 3 times as likely to report being physically or sexually assaulted. So they're more likely to get in fights and be injured, as well as report being physically or sexually assaulted. So they don't do their time very well. The other differences between people with mental illnesses and those without is the experience of homelessness. So state prisoners with mental health problems are twice as likely to have been homeless the year before they were arrested compared to those without a mental illness. And if they were homeless before they spent time in an incarcerated setting, they're more likely to be homeless upon release. And we already know that people that are homeless are more likely to recidivate. So it shouldn't be that surprising that when we compare people with mental illnesses to those without mental illnesses, those with mental illnesses have higher recidivism rates. So we see about a quarter of them recidivate within 12 months and 77% of them recidivate within 36 months. So the average recidivism rate for somebody that does not have a mental illness is about 60% in 36 months. So we see higher recidivism rates. So in general, what we're seeing is they serve longer times in an incarcerated setting. They're more likely to get in a fight and be injured in that fight. They're more likely to report being assaulted physically or sexually, and they have higher recidivism rates. The other thing to note about them that might explain some of this is they have a different age crime curve. So for the average person, the age crime curve is about 15 to 25, which means they age into crime around 15 and they age out of 25. So most people, their peak offending period is between the ages of 15 and 19. But when you look at someone with a mental illness, that shifts a little bit. So people with a mental illness often age into crime later than people that don't have a mental illness. So the peak offending years for someone with a mental illness is about 18 to 20. So what we can see from that is that if you don't have a mental illness, you're more likely to start committing crimes when you're a juvenile, which means you'll be dealt with the juvenile justice system, which is a lot more rehabilitative. If you have a mental illness, by the time you start committing crimes, you're already an adult and you're being dealt with the adult criminal justice system, which is much more punitive. So in a minute, well, first I'm going to tell you why we have so many crazy people in our correctional facility. But then after that, I'm going to talk about ways to try to get them out of the criminal justice system, to divert them out. But quickly, I just want to point out that it's never that black and white. These approaches are useful and necessary, but the reality is that people with mental illnesses will likely always find themselves in a correctional setting. People with mental illnesses do not wear a sign around their neck that says, "I have a mental illness," informing everybody that they should be treated slightly differently. It's not that simple. So for some people, it may not be. We may not realize that they have a mental illness until after they've already started serving their time, They may be stable when they're arrested, then booked in a county jail, and then maybe start displaying symptoms after that. Or their symptoms may go undetected. The correctional officers may not notice. They may have mild symptoms, or something in their environment a year later might stress them out, and that's when their symptoms come out. Or the length of the incarceration, like after 2 years, they hit a wall, and that's when they start expressing symptoms. So it's not that black and white. It's not just that, okay, somebody has a mental illness, we should divert them out of the criminal justice system. It's that sometimes we don't even know. So it's important to make provisions to be able to divert people out of the criminal justice system when they have a mental health issue, but just realize that it's never that black and white. Questions about this before we start talking about why there are so many crazy people? We're good? Sam, you have a question? Will you switch your switch? Oh, there we go.
What did you say the average recidivism rate was within 36 months?
60%.
60%. Thank you.
Yeah. Your dog's really cute. I'm enjoying that.
It's not mine. It's my
Not,
dog.
did you like steal that from someone?
No, it's my fiance dog, but she loves watching these video conferences things.
Oh, okay.
Loves it.
All right. Glad to know you didn't just like steal someone's dog.
Found it on the street.
Okay. Okay. All right. Let's talk about why we have so many people with mental illnesses in our correctional system. So I'm going to tell you guys a story, and it starts with a juvenile, a 15-year-old kid named Ricky Wyatt. So this was way back in the 70s, and Ricky Wyatt was a 15-year-old youth who was committed to an Alabama state hospital. His father committed him due to ungovernable behavior. So at that time in Alabama, in their state mental health asylums, it was pretty common. There were so many people coming in that it was pretty common to just heavily sedate someone and put them in a room. And that's exactly what happened to Ricky Wyatt. So he was heavily medicated to prevent him from acting out, but they didn't do anything else. They didn't give him an individualized treatment plan. And at that time, the state hospital in Alabama was understaffed. So it was fairly normal for them to just heavily medicate or sedate someone and put them in a room, and to try to just sort of triage. So the worst of the worst were the only ones that were given treatment plans. And if they didn't have time or enough staff to get to you, they would just keep you sedated in a room. The physical facilities were inadequate. During this trial, Ricky Wyatt testified that he was sleeping on wet floors. And so it started with Ricky Wyatt, who was suing the person, Mr. Stickney, who was in charge of that mental health asylum, but it wound up being a class action lawsuit because it wasn't just Ricky Wyatt that was receiving this inadequate treatment, just being sedated and thrown in a room, with like wet floors and just sleeping in there with no treatment plan. So they sued. It made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the goal of this class action lawsuit was to establish that patients had a constitutional right to treatment, and that you have to have minimum standards for patients in state hospitals. So what Ricky Wyatt and the rest of the people were saying was, if we are voluntarily or sometimes involuntarily being put in a mental hospital, we have a right to treatment. You can't just sedate us and leave us in a room. You have to try to fix us. So we're saying we have a constitutional right to treatment. That was the point of this lawsuit. And since we have a constitutional right to treatment, we want the Supreme Court to say what those minimum standards are. So Wyatt versus Stickney, which was in 1972, was a federal court decision, and they ruled that Ricky Wyatt and his associates were absolutely correct. That they said that state psychiatric hospitals could not warehouse mentally ill patients without offering some degree of rehabilitation, some sort of treatment plan. So just like you would think would be normal common sense, the Supreme Court had to tell the state hospitals, hey, you can't just sedate people and throw them in a room. You have to actually treat them. So the problem was, so we know, a lot of you took my intro class, we know that when the Supreme Court says something, all states have to do it. And it turns out that Alabama wasn't the only state that was doing this. This was pretty common. So Alabama was not the only state that was unable to provide treatment. So when the Supreme Court mandated that every single patient in a state psychiatric hospital had to have an individualized treatment plan, a lot of state hospitals realized they didn't have the resources to do that. So let's say they had 100 patients in their hospital and they only had 50 beds, right? So they run the numbers and they realize, well, shit, we may only have enough resources to provide individualized treatment plans for 25 of our 100 patients. So instead of being in direct opposition to a federal judicial order, which is what happens with this when the Supreme Court says something, they said, we only have enough resources to give a treatment plan for 25 of our 100 patients. So they just released like 75 because they just didn't have the resources to provide a treatment plan for that, for all 100 patients. So this happened across our nation. Most state hospitals just opted to release the patients that they didn't have the resources to provide individualized treatment plans for. So the way that they were rationalizing this, they were saying, okay, so we can't treat these 75 patients. We don't have the resources to do that. So what we're going to say is we're going to give an individualized treatment plan for the 25 that we can treat, and the 75 that we're releasing, we're just going to tell those mentally unstable patients, hey, could you just get your treatment in the community instead? And if you can't do it, can you just have your family force you to get the treatment that you need? You might be able to start seeing why this was bad logic. So what the mental health leaders were hoping to do was to create services for people with mental illnesses and their families that were done in the community and not in an institutionalized setting. But the problem is that everybody seemed to overestimate the number of people with mental illnesses that would voluntarily go to treatment on their own, because chances are, if you've been locked up in a state hospital, it's because you're not receiving the treatment. You're not going to treatment, right? You're not wanting to go. They were also overestimating the number of family members that either wanted to care for this person or could care for this person. So in this hypothetical example, they've released 75 patients and told those patients, you need to receive community treatment, or your family members need to make sure that you receive this treatment. They were overestimating how many of these people would seek treatment on their own and on a consistent basis. And they were not realizing that a lot of the families either didn't want to take care of this person, or this person was so ungovernable that they couldn't do that, which is why they put them in a state mental health facility. So that was one problem that they were dealing with, was that they released all of these people and these people weren't wanting to get the treatment, or their families couldn't force them to get the treatment that they wanted. Then the next problem that happened, so again, we're dealing with this hypothetical problem, or this hypothetical institution that has 50 beds, but the facility only has the resources to give individualized treatment for 25 patients. So now we have 25 beds that are open. And if that's what's happening across the nation, which it was, the state governors or the state governments realize that they have an opportunity to save some money. So if they have 4 hospitals that are operating at 50% capacity, a lot of them just closed 2 and consolidated. So that's where we get into this idea of deinstitutionalization, is that a lot of state hospitals closed because they were only operating at half the capacity. So now if people wanted to be readmitted to the hospital, the wait list is outrageous because we have half as many beds as we had before. So this ruling, Wyatt versus Stickney, resulted in a decrease of over 70% of state and county psychiatric beds between the years of 1972 and 1990, and it closed about 58 psychiatric hospitals, which just means that the wait list is even longer than it was before, and it just had continued overcrowding. So this ruling, even though it had the best intentions in mind, created a huge clusterfuck. So let's talk about some of these unintended consequences. So the resulting effect of deinstitutionalization of the mental hospitals just flooded the community with mentally ill individuals. And there were some community resources available for people to receive treatment in the community, but they were designed for people that were relatively stable and could live in the community. They were not designed for these severely disturbed patients who had to be admitted to a state psychiatric hospital. So they were not equipped or prepared for the influx of these severely disturbed patients. And then, like I was saying before, a large number of former patients didn't want to seek treatment. Some of the problem is people that have mental illnesses don't think that they have mental illnesses, so they don't want to seek treatment, or they think that the treatment isn't helping them. So it's really hard to force somebody that thinks that they are fine into mental health treatment, or thinks that the treatment that you were giving them is making them worse. So it was overestimating this. So as a result, the number of mentally ill individuals in the communities and their unconventional behavior became the attention of law enforcement. So when you see a crazy person ranting and raving on the side of the road, you don't call your local mental health facility, you call the cops. And that's exactly what started happening. And you can start to see why we're starting to see so many more people with mental illnesses in our prisons and jails. So that was one of the first unintended consequences, is that law enforcement kind of had to pick up the slack here. And the other thing is the rise of the homeless population. So if you look at the numbers of the homeless population, you will see a huge spike right after 1972, and this is why. So in retrospect, this sort of vision of emptying these madhouses and replacing them with this community-based, loving services seems oversimplified. The other concern is that it failed to account for this back and forth movement between going to a mental health facility and the community. So it's pretty common that people with mental illnesses sort of bounce back and forth, right? So they will have some sort of psychotic break, or they'll go off their meds and they'll need to be institutionalized for a while. They'll get their meds back on track. They'll be going through treatment. They'll become stable. They'll be released in the community. They'll do well for 3 to 6 months, maybe a year, and eventually they'll need sort of a reset back in the institution. So this plan to deinstitutionalize failed to account for this back and forth behavior. So where we are today, we have not opened up all these mental institutions that we closed down. So we're kind of in the same boat that we were before, which is exactly why we have so many people with mental illnesses in our correctional system, because there's nowhere else for them to go. So right now, the era that we are in is what we refer to as decriminalization. We're trying to say it shouldn't be illegal to have a mental illness. So what we're hoping to do is to not incarcerate people with a mental illness, because a lot of these people, some of them are committing crimes and should be institutionalized, but a lot of them are committing crimes because they are not receiving steady treatment or they've gone off their meds. And we know that it's not the job of the criminal justice system to provide adequate mental health services. That's not the job of the criminal justice system. So what we're hoping to do is divert them out of the criminal justice system and let them get the treatment where they need to. So what we're saying here is that treatment access should be the major focus of intervention. It's sort of based on the idea that gaps in treatment and going off your meds, that is what leads to arrest. So we just need to get you back into treatment, get you back on your meds, and we don't need to institutionalize you. We don't need to incarcerate you. We just need to get you back on your treatment plan. So what we're trying to do is decriminalize, not make it illegal for you to have a mental illness. So we're trying to divert you out of the criminal justice system and into treatment whenever it's possible. Questions about this? Okay, very good. So this is why we have so many people with mental illnesses in our criminal justice system. It started in 1972, and we have not received funding to increase our mental health asylums since then. Basically, the criminal justice system has had to pick up the slack. All right, so let's talk about some of the ways that we are trying to divert these people out of the criminal justice system. So one strategy involves diversion at the court level. So if a mentally ill person is not diverted out and detained by police due to criminal behavior, then the courts become involved. So it's not as simple as being a patrol officer and realizing that you're dealing with somebody with a mental illness and dropping them off at the doorstep of a mental health facility. First of all, a lot of them won't take you. And second of all, now we know there's no room for them. There are waiting lists. So if they can't do that, if for some reason they are able to do that, there are, we've made some strides since then. There are like mobile crisis teams that can go out if somebody is having a psychotic break, and they can help the cops deal with that. But if that hasn't happened, the next strategy is to try to divert them out at the court level. So judges are then faced with the decision of how to balance the needs of this person with a mental illness against the needs of the community, because we don't want a violent, mentally ill criminal just loose on the streets, right? So one of the things that we've developed are mental health courts. They're just like the drug courts, the veterans treatment courts, the prostitution courts, all those things we've already talked about, but it's for people with mental illnesses. So these have become very popular for dealing with mentally ill offenders. So it was a pretty common view that the traditional courts were not effectively dealing with mentally ill offenders, because these offenders were just sort of spinning through this revolving door of the criminal justice system, because the criminal justice system is not prepared, nor are we inclined to deal with people with serious mental illnesses. We are not the mental health system. We are the criminal justice system. So the goal here is to get them out of the criminal justice system and get them treatment from mental health providers. So just like the drug court, the mental health court's authority stems from linking clients with appropriate treatment services. And the central focus of these courts is to offer supervised mental health services in lieu of prosecution. So we don't want to prosecute you. We want to force you to receive treatment. So just like the drug courts, it's kind of like probation. You're on probation, but the conditions of your release are you're getting treatment and you're taking your meds. So I'm going to say this a million times, just like the other courts, there's wide variability in like specifically how they do this. Some of them are pre-booking, some of them are post-booking. Some of them require you to plead guilty, and then if you do well, they will expunge your charges. Some of them have adjudication withheld, so they'll divert you out right before you have to plead guilty, not guilty, no contest. And if you do well, then they'll dismiss the charges. So we see small differences across all the jurisdictions about how specifically these programs are implemented. But some of the common characteristics are having a specialized docket to manage them. So they're in their own courtroom with the same judge, with the same group of people that are used to dealing with this all the time. So they kind of become specialists in this. And the first thing when you've been admitted to mental health court is a mental health screening. So first, we want to make sure that you're not faking it and that you're actually eligible for mental health court. And we're going to talk about some of the eligibility and exclusion criteria in a minute, but we have to screen you first to find out what mental illness you have. Do you have documentation? Have you been diagnosed with this before? Is it just symptomatic? Have you been on meds? Did you go off meds? Do you have a doctor that you use? So we have to screen you first to figure out what would suit your needs best, and are you eligible for this court? So once we've done that, you have to voluntarily enroll. We can't force you to do this. So as long as you agree to do this, then what we're trying to do is refer you to community mental health facilities for treatment and follow-up planning. And similar to probation, people under diversion to mental health court have to abide by certain conditions mandated by the court for a period of time set by the judge. So it's very individualized. So depending on whatever your mental health concerns are, your treatment plan, those become your conditions for release. And just like some of the other courts, they often have phases that you go through. So the first phase might be more restrictive, and then as you do well, you'll move through the phases that become less and less restrictive. So the first phase might say you have to meet with a judge once a week, you have to go to your therapist 5 times a week, and every single day of the week you have to go by the clinic to get your medication, and they're going to make sure that you actually take your medication. Once you've demonstrated you can do that well, they might move you to the second phase, where you only have to check in with a judge once a month. You go to treatment 3 times a week, or whatever I said, less than whatever I just said. And they might only have you come into the clinic 2 or 3 times a week and give you the stock of pills that you're supposed to take for that entire week. So if you can satisfactorily complete this, any criminal charges could be dropped or expunged. And just like the other courts, we have incentives and sanctions. So if you're doing well, we might move you up to a less restrictive phase of the program, or we might say, hey, you don't have a curfew anymore. If you're doing badly, we might move you down to a more restrictive phase, or maybe put you into some sort of residential treatment program for a night or 2, just to get you straight, especially if you've gone off your meds and you're having some sort of psychotic break. We might sort of have to press pause on your treatment and have you do some sort of residential stay to get you sane again. So let's talk about who's eligible for these courts. So there was a study that was done on about 196 mental health courts, and they found about 85% of them accept all misdemeanor cases. Only about 74% accept felony cases, and only about 20% will accept felony cases that are violent, and very few, only about 1%, will hear cases involving significant violence. So most misdemeanors and felonies, as long as you're nonviolent, you're good for this. If it's a violent felony, only about 20% of the nation's courts will take you. And if it's extremely violent, only about 1%. So the more violent you are, the less likely you are to be able to be eligible for a drug court, because we are releasing you in the community. So that makes sense. So there's also differences in the type of mental illnesses that they will consider to be eligible for mental health court. So about 43% of all courts in the nation will take you as long as it fits with the state's definition of a serious mental illness or a persistent mental illness. Only about 1/3 of the courts will take you if you have a personality disorder. And the last thing that is probably the most problematic is that over half of our nation's courts won't accept you if you have a substance abuse problem that they consider to be your primary disorder. So this is a little bit surprising, considering that a large percentage of people that have a mental illness are also dually diagnosed, meaning they also have a substance abuse problem. So those people that are dually diagnosed often find themselves in sort of a catch-22. The mental health court doesn't want to take them because they say you have a drug problem, you should be in drug court. Drug court doesn't want to take them because they say you have a mental illness, you should be in mental health court. So we sort of see this back and forth between neither court wanting to take them, and they sort of rationalize it, but they'll say, like, the people in mental health court will say, well, substance abuse is the primary disorder, so they should go over to drug court. And drug court will say, well, no, mental illness is the primary disorder, they should be in mental health court. So this is kind of surprising. Right now, we don't have like a dual diagnosis court, which is probably exactly what we need, considering such a large percentage of people with mental illnesses have a substance abuse problem. And this argument about which is the primary disorder is a silly argument to have. It's almost impossible to tell which one came first, which is the primary disorder. It's sort of like trying to decide what came first, the chicken or the egg. So this is a current, so even though we're making strides to try to decriminalize people with mental illnesses, this is a problem right here, the fact that a lot of the mental health courts will exclude you if you have a substance abuse problem, and a lot of the drug courts will exclude you if you have a mental health disorder. So these people that are dually diagnosed often find themselves in a catch-22 and sort of bouncing between courts until we can get one court to accept them, or if we can't, then they just have to be processed through the traditional criminal justice system. Questions about this? Okay, so we're going to end a little bit early today since everybody had to submit their policy brief. I assume that most people are tired and perhaps emotionally drained from this assignment. I just took a look. Most people, I think the average time of submission was about 1 a.m. So I assume that most people are tired. Just a little heads up, I'm probably not going to start getting around to grading these until the end of the week. Right now, I still have a stack of intro papers to grade. Those of you that took my intro class, their second draft was due right before spring break. So you remember how much I did the edits on that one. So I'm currently working on that. So if you are having like extreme anxiety about how you did on the policy brief, try to shoot me an email next week and I'll see if I can get yours graded and just let you know what you had. But the way I have it set up on SitLearn is that your grade won't show up in the grade book until everybody's is graded. Got it? Okay, I'm going to email everybody on Tuesday about the lockdown browser. You have 8 more minutes to submit your policy brief before it is considered late. Please don't email me. Submit it on SitLearn. That's where it goes. Okay? Any questions before we end today? We're all good?
What's the quiz for today that's due? What is it over?
Okay, we're not doing the quiz until Friday. So
Okay.
just like the regular class, we would have our quiz on the last day of lecture, from that lecture. So we'll be talking about treatment of mentally ill offenders today, Wednesday, and Friday. And then the way I have it set up is that the earliest you can take your quiz, let's see, so for your section, it will be at 10:50 on Friday morning, and you have until 10:50 p.m. to take that quiz. So the window is a 12-hour window. Once you start the quiz, you have 30 minutes to take it, and you have to finish it once you start it. Like, you can't start the quiz, pause it, and then like finish it 3 hours later. That's not how this works. So you have 30 minutes to take the quiz. You probably don't need 30 minutes, but they recommend giving you more time because it's online. So that's what we're doing. So you have to take your quiz sometime between 10:50 a.m. on Friday and 10:50 p.m. on Friday. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? All right. Well, look for that email on Tuesday, download that browser, and I'll see everybody on Wednesday morning. All right? Goodbye.